The latest edition of Wine2Wine takes place in Verona on the 25th and 26th of November 2019. I am super honored to have been invited to appear on a panel discussing podcasts, audience growth, education, and social sustainability, which I hope to broadcast here at a later date. As part of my preparation for that talk, I put together a special deck that sets out all of the podcast equipment that I use to produce Interpreting Wine. To see that, and I hope get you started on your podcasting journey, just head to interpretingwine.com/kit. This series was recorded at this year's Wine2Wine in Verona and will feature interviews with the key organizers, as well as selected speakers, bringing the experience of this major digital event and allowing you to feel a part of proceedings no matter where in the world you are. Today's episode of the Wine2Wine series features me in an exclusive podcasting Q&A. In preparation for the session, which I participated in Verona, session moderator Monty Waldin sent all participants a list of 10 questions. Having prepared answers to all 10 questions, I found that in the sessions itself, I was only able to scratch the surface of these answers. So now, sitting here the day after Wine2Wine, I chose to record my full answers to all 10 questions. The voice you'll hear asking the questions is, of course, that of Monty Waldin, host of the Italian Wine podcast. And while I've largely stuck to the answers that I prepared, I also found that the format gave me room to ad-lib and bring out some other opinions. So if you've ever wanted to pick my brain about podcasting, I hope that this episode will give you a thorough insight into where my head is at around podcasting in November 2019. Enjoy!
So podcasting started as a niche medium and is now increasingly becoming mainstream. Why is it growing in your view? How can podcasters leverage this interest, and what is your strategy?
First part of this question about why podcasting is growing, I think it all comes back to time. If you look at where people are listening to podcasts, it's usually when they're on the move, when they're in the gym, when they're commuting, when they're cooking, usually when they're doing something else. So it's one medium that lets you multitask. So you can't go for a run and safely watch a video or read a book. You need to have your focus on what you're doing. Same thing when you're driving. But audio is usually an open channel. And as long as you're not doing something that's overly taking all of your concentration, and you're a kind of an experienced driver, or you're cooking something that's not overly complicated, you've got that channel open and you can be multitasking. You can be doing something else at the same time. You can be learning a language, you can be catching up on the news, you can be listening to interviews with people that you like, or, in my case, through the podcast, you could be learning about wine if that's something that you're interested in. I think beyond that as well, we see that behavior coming in to even affect other mediums. I mean, a lot of people now, you'll probably notice a behavior in yourself. You watch the TV and you'll have your phone out and you'll be doing something else at the same time, listening into the TV, but kind of not there, like sat wrapped and watching it and giving it your 100% attention. And I think more of that's going to happen. It's just maybe a sign of the times that we're always doing something. There's always something that we can be doing, or there's always something that we can be sort of planning ahead with. And the fact that we've got the mobile phone there alongside us means that we're less inclined to put that off until tomorrow, or put it off until the office. If the thing comes up and the opportunity comes up to do it there and then, we'll just usually get on and do it. And that might take time away from that movie or that TV program that we're watching, or even that person that we're with. You often do see this in restaurants as well. But I think all of these behaviors that certainly in London, where I live, are becoming increasingly common. I think they're all about time. They're all about either seizing the moment and doing something while it's in our mind, or saving time by doing two things at the same time. And that's what I see with podcasting. I think that's why it's really finding its niche and finding its audience. And as for the second part, how can podcasters leverage this interest? I think it's very, very simple for anybody that's listening. I think that you should give it a go. You should start a podcast. I'm a firm believer that podcasting is social media. I know there's lots of debates around this, but I'll break it down my point of view. So just listen and think about the word social media or the phrase social media. It's social. To me, that means that anybody has access to it. It means that there are no barriers to entry. Anybody can kind of get on and give it a go. And media is that it's based around a particular type of media. At the beginning, there was Facebook and there were photos. That was largely the driver of Facebook right back at the beginning. And we're just now in a phase, I think, with podcasting where the media are audio files. And the beauty of that then is that anybody has got access to that. So I've produced, in preparation for the presentation at Wine2Wine, a kit guide that lays out every single piece of equipment that I use to produce Interpreting Wine, and I've used from the start and I still use now. I've uploaded that at interpretingwine.com/kit, that's KIT. And I come to the conference and my one wish is to get one person who either came to the talk or will listen to this podcast afterwards, to get them to actually give it a go. It's something that for whatever reason people are tripping up at the kit stage. It's the most asked question that I have. What kit are you using? That's not going to be the thing that keeps you going and kind of unlocks your creativity and provides your motivation. But it is the first step. You kind of need some level of kit to kind of get onto the playing field. And I would just, highly recommend, people just give it a go. And if you're like, if you kind of just want to give it a go and kind of want a reasonable price access point. My kit guide, it prices everything out, and the overall price of the equipment I use is about £130. And then the ongoing monthly cost for what I use and my exact setup that's set out in the kit guide is around £10 to £20. So, if that seems like something that you could reasonably commit to and invest for the next 6 months or so, then, why not get the kit guide, see what's in there. You can kind of buy it off Amazon, have it delivered, and then you're on the field. You're then in the place where you're thinking about what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, versus are you even going to be playing in the first place?
Anyone with a voice and an internet connection can become a broadcaster. So is podcasting's low technical barrier to entry a good or bad thing from a wine perspective?
Listen, I think the first answer to this question is kind of what I've just intimated before. Podcasting is social media. The whole thing around, low barrier to entry, it exists for podcasting, but it exists in exactly the same way for Facebook or for Instagram. And arguably the barrier there is even lower. So, anyone with a computer or anybody with a phone can get an Instagram account and start posting things, and can get a Facebook account and start posting things. So I think we're just in that same sort of ballpark, really. It's not really anything different. Okay, and then that low barrier to entry, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it all depends on the marketplace, because, you have a marketplace for people's attention. Are people listening to what you've got to say? If we try to bring it back to a wine perspective, I personally think that a lot of time when people in wine are creating content, they can wear their knowledge quite heavily. They can get into production details, and they can get into tasting notes, and they can get into a lot of areas where potentially the end consumer isn't actually that concerned with. And will wine do that with podcasting? I think that's maybe the bigger question. What is the tone? If a winery starts a podcast, what is the tone that they're going to take with that podcast? What is their voice going to sound like? I think a lot of times people have an idea of brand, and they know what the kind of look and feel. I mean, even just those that phrase, look and feel, it's a visual thing. What does your brand sound like? How authoritatively do you want to be talking about wine? Or do you want to go the other way? Do you want to kind of adopt a more kind of friendly voice? Is it something that you're trying to draw people in? I try to go for a relatively informal approach when I'm doing interviews. So I don't overly prepare. I don't sort of have things scripted. I like to feel that my episodes are like a conversation, and I always try to include the listener in that conversation. I always try to have the microphone essentially be the third person within a conversation if I'm having a one-to-one with somebody, and then that somebody who's listening later on, they will then be in that third position. They'll be the third person in the room, the fly on the wall, or whatever you like to call it, and that they'll then feel included in that conversation. So that, I think, is a powerful thing. I think it's one reason why I've had some success at drawing people in, because they don't feel necessarily that there's a barrier between them. They don't feel necessarily that there's kind of lots of information that's put on there, or that we get too technical. We do often cover quite technical information, but it's covered in I think a sort of fairly accessible, sometimes light-hearted way. But I don't encourage people to think as though they're talking to the trade. I just encourage them to be themselves and just to talk as though they would talk to a normal human being.
Wine is still a confusing, frustrating, snobby minority sport for most everyday mortals. The BBC's mantra is to educate, inform and entertain. Should podcasts share these exact same goals?
Again, I probably started to answer this question a bit in the previous question, because I started talking about tone. Yeah, I think wine, again, it does often get overly complicated when it doesn't necessarily need to. And I'll, share my own shortcomings here. I think, I hold the WSET Level 2 qualification, which is, not the most advanced of qualifications. Yet the people who I feature on the podcast and the people that I want to have talking to my audience and invite to come talk to my audience, they're often much more highly qualified than that. And whether the aim of my podcast is to educate, inform and entertain, I think, I try to do all three, I would say. I do try to get all of those elements in there, and I think they do naturally come about. And probably, rather than me sitting down when I'm doing interviews and kind of thinking, am I educating, am I entertaining, am I informing? I like to think that I do the work up front. I like to think that actually my biggest two things that I focus on when I'm doing putting together the podcast are the choice of guests. So I will research people quite thoroughly before I have them on, and target them and reach out to them based on the value I think that they can provide to my audience. And then, the second thing that, where I focus on is not necessarily being in front of the mic. Mainly linked to the fact that, I'm usually not the most qualified person on there. I think that my background and experience are actually better in creating the environment, kind of almost creating the canvas and setting the table for that expert to lay out their knowledge in a highly accessible way, and in a way that will communicate well across the medium. Often people that come on, be they whatever, masters of wine, masters sommeliers, experienced winemakers, they often haven't been on many podcasts in their life. I've produced more than 300 now, nearly 350. And so I have a very good idea around, what will sound good and what will kind of draw and what will keep people listening. So I focus on that. I focus on choosing the guest. I focus on making them sound as good as they can when they come on. And I think that those two together have been the right things to focus on. I see myself staying there in terms of my focus going forward. And I think that the feedback I've had is that I've managed to get the best out of people when I've had them on.
In what ways can podcasts be useful for students facing wine tasting exams like Master Sommelier, WSET or Master of Wine?
I think this is a huge area that podcasts can play a massive role in. So I very early on in doing the podcast, I approached the WSET, the Wine Spirit Education Trust, and spoke to them about actually recording some of their, again, very highly experienced educators on the podcast, getting their knowledge down, again, as I've just described, setting the scene for them to come on and share their knowledge. And the most recent of these visits to the WSET, because I believe I've been down there 3 times now to record a sort of mini series of interviews, was earlier this year when I went down and spoke with now MW Christine Marsilio, and we together, I recording and she doing most of the talking, did an assessment of 3 different wines at level 4, so that's at the diploma level, and all 3 of these wines were sparkling wines. So this was a podcast that had been prepared and was designed to be listened to by somebody who was about to sit or was preparing to sit their Unit 5 exam. One of the things in terms of the design of that particular podcast series was that all 3 of these champagne, so the champagne, the Prosecco, the Cava, should all be relatively easily accessible in the UK market. And then the outcome of that then, of each of those released separately, so one for Cava, one for Prosecco, and one for Champagne, was that somebody could go out and find those sparkling wines, could bring them home, could open them, put them in the glass at home, have them in front of them, could then press play on that episode of the podcast once it had been released, and could hear Christine giving her assessment, could hear her nosing, looking at the wine in the glass, smelling it, tasting it, and going through that level 4 assessment very, very methodically. And this, I think, is one of the, well, it's certainly one of the most popular episodes that I've put up this year, and I think it's probably the best example that I can think of where that has got a direct correlation and a direct connection with somebody who's about to sit that exam. And indeed, I had people on Instagram like tagging me, tagging the episode, tagging the bottle, and saying that they were sitting down, they were listening along at home, they were tasting, they were smelling, they were calibrating really their palates with Christine, who from memory, had written the WSET level 1 and 2, as I say, is now a Master of Wine. So somebody who is busy, is in demand, but through that podcast medium, her sitting down with me for that hour and a half or however long means that she then gets to impact and to reach people like all over the world, albeit there were certain sparkling wines that were perhaps more readily available in supermarkets in England. That we also used a brand, Paul Roger, which is available all over the world. So, somebody who's in America and was sitting their Unit 5 exam could have accessed the Paul Roger, could have done the same thing, could have sat down, put it in a glass, hit play, and tasted along with Christine, no matter where they are in the world. So I think that example is actually the best way that I can show. Now, I think the thing that goes beyond that is that the WSET, they don't produce their own materials in that way. It might be something that they decide to look at in the future. So essentially, I've done that in conjunction with them, and I'm very grateful for them giving me the access and the time to do that. But really, anyone who's listening, there's no reason why you can't do something similar. The field is wide open. If you're a WSET school, it'll be even easier because you have the people who are teaching, you have the knowledge. You can just, again, go to interpretingwine.com/kit, go and buy that kit, and you can do exactly what I've done, but without even needing to go to somebody else to do the recording. You can do the recording yourself. You can have that as a resource that you share with your students before they sit their exams. Wineries can do this. I don't see any reason at all why somebody who's in an iconic region of the world couldn't start producing podcast materials to help people prepare for exams on that region. If you're over in Barolo, then why not actually create a series of tasting notes and kind of tasting experience, a kind of a taste along podcast series, in the same way that I did with the WSET. You could do that for your audience, but it would be based on your region and your wines, and you could share that. And I don't see any reason why, if you wanted to, you couldn't partner with people who are in any of those countries, sommeliers, people who are experts in wine. And why not create a set of materials that can help and can spread the word of your wines out there in the world? This can be done by wineries. It could be done by educators. It could be done by importers. It could be done by anybody. I'm a firm believer that there's a lack of training materials and educational materials that are out there in a podcast format. And as goes to show by my experience, the person that puts them out there will find their audience. People will find you. They'll track down the information and they'll listen.
What potential revenue streams are there in podcasting?
Okay, revenue streams. So this is the second most asked question I get. First is usually, what kit do you use? So you say we've already answered that question by putting together the kit guide. But yeah, revenue streams. I think for podcasts, I actually think the first thing to do is actually just to think, do you want to monetize the podcast? Do you need to monetize the podcast? I think there are many people out there who use the podcast medium as a marketing tool. So they're not actually trying to monetize the podcast in and of itself. So I know that Chris Scott, who produces the UK Wine Show, he runs a successful training company and he sells training materials, and that's the element that he's trying to monetize. But he is producing the UK Wine Show for his own education. I'm sure to get in front of people, to get in front of producers and whoever that he chooses to have coming on the show. So he, to my knowledge, is not actually seeking to monetize the podcast in and of itself. The monetization happens elsewhere, and that's a fine strategy that seems to be working for him. I think you can actually directly monetize the podcast. I mean, the most obvious way is advertising revenue. I'm sure we've all been there. You hit play, you're listening along, and then somebody interrupts essentially your listening experience in the same way that they do with TV ads, and then they're telling you about a product. I guess the thing that you would like to hope is that they've been chosen wisely, and that there's actually potential return on investment for them, and that they're actually selling something that you might well be interested in. I mean, the stats that are out there show that actually people will buy from podcast ads. I mean, I have a stat that says 60% of people have bought from a podcast ad. So they can be very, very effective for conversion. But I think the most important thing is that it's right, it's sensible. That you're not, if you're a producer, a podcast producer, and somebody approaches you, that you don't just say yes and put the money ahead of the listening experience of your audience, because you'll lose on all sides there. The person who's advertising won't get what they need from it, and your listeners won't get what they're looking for. They'll be like, what's going on here? Why is this popping up now? And you'll lose out, because from both sides, you won't have a happy advertiser. They won't come back. And I'm sure you'll start to lose people listening as well. So just be aware, I think, of who you let access your audience and who you let advertise. I'll speak to myself as well here. I'm in the belief that I'm not trying to monetize my audience. I'm not looking to use Patreon. I'm not looking to kind of put any sort of toll booth in between my audience and the content. I have a quite strongly held view around access to content being free. I want to be able to let people access the show from no matter where they are in the world, no matter, obviously they need the computer or the phone to be able to access, and the internet connection and all of that infrastructure. But once they've got it, I feel like, okay, that's already excluding such a big percentage of the world. There's still so many people out there that are disenfranchised by just those basic things to us in the West, that why should I then, as well as having that being a barrier to entry, why should I then put a monetary barrier on top of that as well? That being said, I'm very clear that I do want to monetize, and that I do want this to grow and develop into my main source of income. So where's the gap? What's the thing that I do then? So I'm trying to be, as I say, I'm trying to be the free newspaper at the metro station, rather than somebody going in and paying and buying the Financial Times or whatever other newspaper. So my idea, rightly or wrongly, is, as I say, not to monetize the audience, but actually to monetize people that want to reach my audience. So I'm a firm believer, and I'm seeking to work with wine regions, wine countries who feel like they're trying to influencers, basically. They're trying to reach sommeliers, they're trying to reach importers, they're trying to reach people who may either buy their wines or may influence the general public to buy their wines. And I think that also includes bartenders, who I think are a woefully under reached segment of the marketplace that the wine world seems to just completely ignore. So how do I propose? I mean, I have a media pack that I'm communicating with a number of different wine regions and as I say, wine producing regions and countries. And my view is that the best way to do that is to actually approach them with a subject matter expert, and to actually go to them and say to that particular region, look, okay, you're going to get access to my audience. Do you have a subject matter expert that you'd like me to work with? I think that actually the content that could be produced in a series really that would be produced for a wine producing country and then broadcast on Interpreting Wine, it would reach people in different parts of the world instantaneously. That there's literally zero friction around that. The cost of delivery, I believe, it would be way less than going down a sort of more traditional magazine type route. A sort of an advertorial piece written about your region or about your wine producing country. And then I think that also has an associated ecological benefit as well, because there is an ecological cost to transmitting a newspaper or a magazine somewhere around the world. There's got to be packaging, there's got to be printing, there's got to be freight of some sort, be that sea or more likely than not air freight. Whereas digital transmission, okay, there may well be some kind of radiation or so something, but a relatively small ecological impact compared to sending a physical hard copy around the world. There's also very little friction. I mean, in terms of getting into somebody's hand over in Japan, if you're doing this through a traditional print media versus that same person in Japan being subscribed to Interpreting Wine, and when the first episode goes live, if they're already subscribed, it's just going to appear on their phone. They're not going to have to go anywhere else, and equally, they're not going to have to find your ad, because where are you advertising when you're going down the print media route? Are you investing in paying to be on the front page? Is that even economically viable anymore? Are you paying for sort of center spread or some kind of big insert, or is your ad and your advertorial or whatever it is that you decide to put in there, is that kind of nestling in there away on page 53? Are you basically just deluding yourself that somebody that you're trying to get to will pick up the mag, will get it in their hand, will pay attention to it, will get to page 53, will actually then pay attention to your ad, and then will actually take action based on that? I personally think that that's leaving too many things up in the air, and that actually working with me or somebody like me and making the investment there is actually a far better, more reliable way and more ecologically sound way of reaching your audience, but actually they're more effective. You've got time, you've got impactful content, and it lets people who you're trying to impact, it lets them spend time learning about your wines, learning about the brand, actually getting some real value. And for all the reasons that I've spoken about earlier, the audio reaches people where video and printed can't. Who's in the gym reading a trade mag? People in the gym, you see them all the time. They've got earphones in, they're listening to something. So they could be listening and learning about your wines while they're lifting weights.
Is generating a revenue stream via advertising or sponsorship integral to a successful podcast? Listeners are unlikely to fast forward a podcast if a short audio ad starts to run. By the time you found the fast forward button, the ad is finished. So the potential for a captive audience exists within this medium.
Okay, again, I've probably started answering this question in the previous answer, but I'll keep it super short. I mean, I have got some research based around this. So this is research produced by a company called Midroll, who regularly survey podcast listeners, and they found that while people are running away from ads on other platforms, it's 60% and upwards of people sometimes or always ignore ads on radio, on TV, on billboards, and banner ads on their computer or their phone. 86% of podcast listeners subscribe to a premium video service like Netflix. So that additional segment are kind of running away from TV ads by being on Netflix. 81% of listeners say they sometimes or always pay attention to podcast ads. So, to your point, it may just be that they don't have the time to kind of find the fast forward. There isn't something called an ad blocker yet for podcasts, so they don't actually have a way to kind of fast forward them or avoid them altogether. And then, 60% of podcast listeners, as I mentioned, have bought something from a podcast ad. So these stats, okay, fair enough. Midroll are a company that actually sell advertising, so it's in their interest, but you can't argue with those numbers. People are listening to podcasts, ads, I think, as well as the reason that they maybe can't have them blocked out and can't sort of run quickly enough away from them. I actually think they feel a sense of loyalty to the presenter and to the show, and they realize, look, okay, I'm not paying for this. It's on a free channel, but this person has put the time in. Let's listen to the ad at least. Let's actually engage with what this person who is the kind of their friend, their host, the person they've got the attachment with, they've allowed this person to come on. They've allowed this brand to come on and communicate with me. And I think people will then give that brand kind of the benefit of the doubt. If it's almost like, their friend, their host, as I say, has kind of let them into the conversation. And while you've already built up that association with the host, you're going to be then more receptive to this brand that they're introducing you to. So I think that's kind of what's driving the 81%. And I think then, the 60% of people who are buying, that then goes back to my earlier point. Who are the brands that you're letting on? If you've got a podcast or you're going to be looking for ad revenue from a podcast that's already out there, I think just be really, really careful, because, if you are there kind of letting this brand in, and this brand turns out to be either not ethical or not aligned with where your listeners' ethics and kind of morals are and just what they're into, basically. If it just doesn't fit, it's going to jar. And 60% I think is a pretty high figure of people that are buying from podcast ads. But I would imagine that it's so high mainly because the person who's placing the ad, the host who's letting that ad and that brand onto their platform, has really done their homework, done their due diligence, and understands their audience and is letting an appropriate ad and brand in to speak to them.
How do you grow an audience for your podcast? Research in the UK in September 2018 by Ofcom suggested half of UK podcast listeners were under 35.
Okay, I'll take these kind of in reverse order, really. So, podcasting is a young game, I would say. People that are listening to podcasts, as the stats say, half of UK podcast listeners are under 35. what tends to happen, I think, on social media is that things will age up. It's often the parents or the kind of older friends and relatives maybe of younger people who are kind of, looking over their shoulder, asking them what are they into and kind of, using them as a way to figure out kind of what's cool or what's kind of up to date. And I think the kind of best example I can think of is Facebook. Look at how Facebook first started. It was very, very young medium, and then just gradually over time, it's actually aged up. The average age on the platform has consistently gone up, and that's kind of one of their big challenges. It's why I think that they're looking at and they have bought things like Instagram and things that are geared towards younger audiences. Why they tried to buy Snapchat, and then when they couldn't buy them, they ended up copying all their features for Instagram anyway. So podcasting has got a young audience, but no doubt that will certainly age up. As for then just growing your audience anyway, so I think the point there is don't just think about the young and even don't kind of disqualify yourself from entering this marketplace if your product or service doesn't necessarily appeal to a young audience. It will age up. There are older people listening on there that on podcast channels. They're just probably not in the majority. I personally think that the main way that's open to you, so if you're trying to grow a podcast and you don't have money, there's obviously lots of ways that you can advertise, and you can kind of sponsor things on social media, and you can kind of target and make sure that you're front of mind for your target audience. But let's assume that you're not spending any money, then you've got to spend time. And I personally, my approach has been to kind of be like Netflix. So I have really gone far away from the traditional model of, okay, we're going to put out a weekly show, once a week. We're going to have our broadcast and that's it. Okay, guys, that's all you get for now. See you kind of next Wednesday. And I think, the internet doesn't necessarily play by those rules. And I think that if you look at people who have grown on other channels and things like YouTube and on Instagram, I don't think they've gotten there by posting once a week. They've posted many, many more times than that, and they've done other things in the background. So to put it into context, I, on Interpreting Wine, produced 220 episodes in 2018. That is a lot. That's like 4 every week. It's completely unsustainable as well, I would have to say. I probably would never do that again, although I think I probably could. But no doubt that is, I think, forever going to be one of the main reasons why I've managed to establish the podcast so quickly. People were kind of seeing, I think, the quality and quantity, and it just got them curious. So many times people were like, "Oh, who are you? How come you sort of suddenly appeared here and you're interviewing all these kind of people that we're either friends with or that we admire? Who are you?" I really think that it built up a lot of intrigue, and to the point where I was actually then interviewed for the podcast in episode 100. So I just think, I think in this case, be more like Netflix. Who has watched every single video on Netflix? I think the idea behind Netflix is to have always more things to watch, always have, even if you don't have the time to watch them, always knowing that there are more things that you could be watching and that you would like to be watching. So I never fear about overloading people. I just think that the way that people consume media, they may, and they do binge watch series. So I give them the opportunity, I open the door to them to binge listen to podcasts whenever they want to. I don't assume that if I'm releasing on once a week that they're going to sort of turn up. I would say, I think there's also a timing point around that. I think that if you had started a podcast 10 years ago, 12 years ago, then it may have been okay. It may have been all right to just post once a week or once a month. I know there are some massively successful podcasts like the Guild of Sommeliers. They post once a month, I believe, still. And if you're doing that, then but you have the tenure of doing that. You've had the the experience of growing, and you've also had a very strong name, and you've had things like the Som movie kind of helping you as well, and kind of doing some marketing for you as well. So those things haven't just existed in isolation. The other thing, as well as volume, I think as well, is to grow other channels. So grow other social media channels. Again, podcasting is social media. You can grow an Instagram following. You can grow a Twitter following. You'll probably find that one of the other channels that's out there and is popular will kind of appeal to you more than another. I grew Instagram pretty much in line along the same times that I was growing the podcast audience, and was very active and very regimented, I guess, really, about every episode. At the end, I would give the Instagram handle, and then on the Instagram, I would send people to the podcast. Go and find the podcast, go and listen, putting up selfies so they knew what I looked like, and they could kind of come and approach me even at tastings and things like that, and we can have a chat and then post a picture of that. I think it's just, lots. It's just more. It's just get lots of content out there, because that's, one of the things at this particular time in our, in our evolution and our relationship with the internet, where you're going to get people. They're going to be on their phone. A lot of times in London, in big cities around the world, Los Angeles, New York, people use their phones a lot. And when they're on their phones at this time, in a moment in time, they're tending to be on social networks. So, podcasting is great, I think, because it actually then shows up in multiple networks. I hit post on my episodes. They turn up in iTunes, they turn up in Spotify, they turn up in SoundCloud. So you can reach your audience wherever they are. But then also, if you're in Instagram and you're in Facebook, then you're kind of capturing more of their attention over time. And when they see you on Instagram, they'll no doubt interact with you in a different way because they've already listened to your podcast on Spotify.
Sustainability and climate change are dominating all news agendas, not just in wine. So how can audio play a role in making the wine industry greener and more inclusive?
Okay, this is an easy one for me. I always think here around travel with wine. My understanding is that actually the biggest polluter, if you like, the biggest sort of CO2 footprint with wine is actually around packaging and distribution of the wine product. You're not going to transmit a wine down a podcast or down an internet cable. So what I think, and where I think actually the podcast and other social media can help, is around travel. So, case in point, so I always use the example of New Zealand, because that is, from here in London, it's one of the most remote places on the planet, and they have their markets are all very far away from them. They have their own local market, which I know is very important to the wine producing people of New Zealand, but they need to be selling in Los Angeles, they need to be selling in New York, they need to be selling in the whole of the US, they need to be selling in Canada, they need to be selling in Europe, they need to be selling in London, especially, I think. So how do they do that? I think the main way that wineries, that regions, that wine boards do that is by communicating, by communicating their uniqueness. What is it that makes, again, just using an example of New Zealand, what is it that makes New Zealand wine different than wine that comes from Austria or, wine that comes from Israel? They are communicating their difference. And I think in order to really kind of ramp up that communication, they try to do a certain proportion of it face to face. And then I think that's where then really the ecological angle really comes to the fore. When you look at New Zealand, who are, I'm just picking on because of their location, they're either then bringing people to them. I know they run sometimes competitions, or maybe they just organize trade trips to bring the trade out to New Zealand. So they're hopping on a plane in LA, in New York, in London, in Paris. They're getting on the plane, they're going the 20 whatever it is hours down to New Zealand, and they're staying there, and they're doing whatever when they're down there as well. They're driving around. You know, they've got a continued carbon footprint all through their journey, and then they go home. So you know that's a pretty major sort of polluter, I guess you would say, and something that's kind of inevitable if you want people to get closer to New Zealand in that way. The other way that they might do it is to then go and meet the market. I know that they've done various events, you know, again, all around the world. And if we kind of, for the sake of this answer, put the idea of the wine transportation, if we assume the wine's already there, but what if you want to get one of your fantastic New Zealand winemakers there in London and to pour their wines? They've got to get on a plane. They've got to do exactly the same thing, but in reverse. So no matter which way round you do it, even if you meet halfway, you're still going to have this massive transportation cost, and that's not very green. You know, I don't think anybody can kind of say that is. So my view on how podcasting can play into this is that actually, for many, many reasons, podcasting is a way to really bring people close. It is a very intimate space. I mean, I always ask the question, you know, who do you have in your ear? You know, how often do you actually make voice calls anymore? How often do you actually listen to somebody in your ear? It's probably going to be very few people. It's probably going to be, your boss, maybe a colleague at work, and then probably your family and your loved ones and your very closest friends. I think increasingly now, you know, that whole thing of picking up the phone and talking to somebody and having a conversation, kind of letting that person in your ear, if you like, it's reserved for very, very few people. And I think that's where podcasting can win, is that you're creating this moment, this very intimate space. So I would personally say, and you know, some might say, yeah, he would say that, but I'll say it anyway. I would say that where you've got a New Zealand and they're trying to influence the UK or they're trying to influence America, and say they're bringing people over to New Zealand, then they should have podcasters there. They should have podcasters recording the event, recording the tours, recording the tastings, recording the New Zealand winemakers. Equally, they should have podcasters there interviewing the guests who have come over there. What are their impressions of New Zealand? What are they seeing? Getting them, of course, once they've gotten over the jet lag, but with fresh eyes, people who are from completely different markets, completely different hemispheres of the world, literally. What are their, honest views and observations about New Zealand wine? Really capture that. I personally don't think it's just should be linked to podcasting. I mean, I'm not just banging the drum for myself or for other wine podcasters. I think on those sorts of trips, there should be at least 4 different specialists. You should have a podcast guy, you should have somebody filming, you should have somebody taking photographs, and you should have somebody writing. You should have this kind of team there, this kind of, as I say, at least 4, maybe doubling up in 1 or 2 of those positions that are all capturing, that are all creating that content around that, so that actually you don't need to, or you don't want to bring 20 people down to increase your reach and to increase your influence. You might bring 10 people down plus the 4. You net, you're reducing the carbon footprint of that trip, but actually you're increasing the impact of the trip, like by a factor of God knows what, because you then, as well as having those 10 carefully chosen people there on the ground in New Zealand who are talking and tweeting and whatever, they're speaking to their audience, you've then got the content that's harvested by that additional 4, so that then pretty much, for the rest of your year or for certainly several months after that, you're able to drip feed all of the experiences, all of the insights that you've shared with those visiting 10, and of course the hosts and the winemakers and whoever else it might be a stakeholder in that trip. You've got the content to share it out there, and that's when you don't have to create banks of printed material, and you don't have to ship these things. Digital is light. Digital travels, at the speed of data. So that's then a much more economically, first and foremost, and ecologically friendly way to go about influencing.
How close Are we from peak podcast, a surfeit of players? And what might the implications be?
So the figure I have is 750,000 podcasts worldwide versus YouTube's 22 million channels. So the other stat as well that I understood and learned from Elizabeth Schneider, who creates and broadcasts Wine for Normal People, is that actually 75% of the 750,000 podcasts are not in active production. So only 25% are actually active. So by my maths, that makes 187,000 active podcasts. And the number of podcasts has increased by 50% in the last year as well. That's another stat that I have. So yeah, how far away from peak podcast? I don't think we've even really started to scratch the surface. I just think that basically podcasting is playing catch up. We have had, I think, a focus on video, a run, a bull market, whatever you want to call it, in visual, driven by the success of platforms like Instagram and Facebook, and I think is now even getting a second wind through platforms like TikTok and Snapchat. They've been well in the ascendancy, and essentially, audio is playing catch up, and it's getting more and more popular. I think that once people discover podcasts and again where they can listen to them, and they maybe get out of the habit of consuming so much long form video, as the stats already show that they are getting out of the habit of doing, and they start consuming more audio, they're going to be looking for things on their interests, things that kind of appeal to them. How far away we are from peak podcast, I think is still is far off, because when I started interpreting wine back in January 2018, I approached the wine trade. I approached people I knew, and one of the things I was consistent in asking them was, what are your must listen to podcasts? And consistently only two came back as answers. One was the UK Wine Show, and the other one was I'll Drink to That with Levi Dalton. So those were the two, and in a whole media, in a whole sector, something as influential as wine and big as wine, you're only going to get two that are consistently coming up. That's a gap. For fun, I keep asking the question, and there's not that many that keep coming up. It hasn't really changed in the last 2 years. I like to think that my name now is listed on there, and more than my name, that my podcast, Interpreting Wine, is listed on there. The picture's quite different in the US. I think this is probably where the answer would be quite different to somebody in the US and the UK. I'm less close to who the big players are over there, but I know there are far more that are kind of in active production. So I would say, if you're in the US, maybe be quite thoughtful around your niche, and again, the same advice. If you want to go for it, if you've done the research, it's competitive, you find your niche, just go for it. Don't be tied to a traditional publishing model of one a week or one a month or one every 2 weeks. Just go for it. Just get them out there. Think like Netflix. I think we've probably got it a bit easier in the UK. I think, as I say, there's far fewer players over here that are kind of really going for it and really putting out content consistently. So almost, I would say, kind of in the way that I did, you could almost just get onto the field, start playing in the UK, and maybe find your niche, find your style as you go along, and maybe it's a bit more forgiving a market to get into than in the US.
Should wine podcasts be studio-based, or should more be made on location?
Okay, the easy answer to this is both. So no doubt you've seen, I'm a very, very creative person. I don't just sit with one particular production style, don't sit with one particular type of guest. And here's the big secret about Interpreting Wine, is that it's not even a wine podcast. I've had a rum series that I ran back in September. I had a mezcal series that I ran in October. I've run series that I've recorded in Lisbon where they've been focused on cultural change makers and not actually focused on winemakers. So I'm very much in that medium of where I'm a hospitality podcast. I think that wine will always be very important to me. I think that I don't have any desire to change the name of the podcast, but I think that if somebody is into good wine, then they'll be into good spirits and they'll want to take interesting holidays as well. I don't think that these audiences necessarily need to be like segmented to death and kind of kept apart for one another. So I think, that's kind of my rant on the topic itself. And then, if we then say, okay, I'm just going to produce wine content for the rest of my life, if that was going to be the case, which I don't think it is, what format would I take? I just look again back to the same old thing, interpretingwine.com/kit. Go and look online. Go and look at the kit that I use, and I'm using to record this right now. It's light. I'm here. I'm on my feet. I'm moving around. I'm able to be at home and in my inverted commas studio. But I'm not chained to a table. I don't have a big chunk of machinery in front of me. I'm being kind of, as I say, on my feet in a way that lets me just talk and rant as I am. That then has the crossover of letting me go on location no matter where I want to. And I would just say, go and listen to the interview I recorded with Martin Waldin over in Wagram, which I released quite recently. And we were out in the field there. We were out in this sort of this hut, basically, this area that people used to use when they were, I guess, when they were harvesting and they wanted to just have a bit of chill out time. They wanted to rest and relax, and we could just sit down in the shade. I remember being a amazing, lovely day, and go and listen to that episode, and you'll hear. We both, I think, enjoyed that, and I think that helped our energy, and I think that transmitted a better listening experience. Had I only had a studio and that was the only place I was going to record in, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to go and record in Wagram, and B, certainly if it was a heavy setup kit that I could have sort of lugged over there and set up somewhere at a hotel or something, I wouldn't have been able to get that out into the field and have that kind of experience with him. So I just think, look, get a light setup that you can adapt and that you can add to. Because what my setup also lets me do, and this will show in other examples, and I guess it's a flavor of kind of getting out in the field, is that as well as having the mic, the kind of hold it in your hand and talk into it like I'm doing now, you can also put what's called a lav mic on, like you see on the TV. You just clip it on. It's mobile. I could be with a winemaker walking out, going down the rows, them talking about their pruning, them even doing pruning, you getting the pruning sounds, and the mic's not in the way. It's just there. It's clipped on. It's picking all of that up. I've done that before on tours when we've been kind of walking around. Also with this very same piece of equipment, I've tapped into AV systems. Where somebody has been kind of professionally mic'd up. Thinking back to the New Zealand masterclasses back in January, Rebecca Gibb, puts on a mic. She's there giving her talk. It's not intrusive, but all the while it's being picked up by my equipment, and then that means that her talk, which seen by 32 people on the day, is then able to be listened to 600, 700, 800 times by people all over the world without any cost, without any ecological impact, without people needing to get flights or travel. It's just a better way, I think, to get the content out there. So my opinion, I just think, the key thing here with all of this, and it keeps coming back to it, is not to sweat the detail. You'll work it out on the way. You'll get there. I mean, my very first series of episodes were of a much lower sound quality, and B, they were made in a format that just didn't suit my style, and this format didn't last. It's only the same format and has been going in the first 8 episodes, and I changed. I think, but the important thing, and the first episode will always be the most important one. Why? Because it was the first. It was that, getting onto the field, figuring out how to make the hosting work, figuring out how to appear on iTunes and how to appear on the channels where people want to be looking for podcasts and where they expect to find you. So I just think, get on the field, start to play. If you think it's a game that you'd like to be playing, I'd love to put my hand out and help you onto the field. Just, you know where to reach me. I'll drop it into the outro. As I said in the session itself in Italy, and as I'll say again right now, my goal in preparing this content is to get one of you to join me on the field and start playing in the podcasting arena. Additionally, I'd also love to have your feedback on the format of this episode. I, for one, really enjoyed ad-libbing and bringing out the ideas that I've got, which are the most current and honest ones that I have on the arena of podcasting and where I see interpreting wine developing. So why not get in touch? You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Interpreting Wine. You can track me down on Twitter, where I'm at Wine Podcast. Or shoot me an email, hello@interpretingwine.com. This marking the end of my coverage of Wine2Wine 2019. It's only left for me to say a huge thank you to Stevie Kim and all of the organising team at the conference. I think you all did an absolutely fantastic job, and I take my hat off to you. It's not an underestimation to say I'm already looking forward to next year. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to all of the guests who appeared on this podcast series. And of course to Monty for moderating the podcast session in Verona and providing these questions as food for thought. And finally, thank you for listening. And of course, see you next time.